Imagine suffocating in a foot of freezing, blood-soaked mud, weighed down by 80 pounds of steel armor, while the sky turns black with a relentless storm of screaming, steel-tipped arrows. You aren't just fighting the enemy, you are being slaughtered by common peasants holding nothing more than pieces of yew wood and string. This was the brutal reality for the elite knights of France at the Battle of Agincourt. In 1415, the absolute flower of French nobility was butchered by a starving, diseased, and massively outnumbered English army. By all logic, this was the end. England was quite literally on the verge of taking the crown and permanently erasing France from the map of Europe. But they didn't. Instead, just when total annihilation seemed inevitable, an illiterate 17-year-old peasant girl who claimed she heard the voice of God stepped out of nowhere. Within months, she would completely shatter the supposedly invincible English war machine, flip the entire balance of global power, and change the course of history forever, before suffering one of the most horrific betrayals imaginable. This is the 100 Years' War, a 116-year meat grinder of political backstabbing, devastating plagues, and ruthless scorched earth massacres. It was the ultimate conflict that permanently killed the romanticized age of chivalry and birthed the modern era of professional standing armies. But how did a petty, localized family dispute over a vacant throne trigger over a century of total, unadulterated carnage? Why did the heavily armored, legendary knights of the Middle Ages fall so easily to commoners wielding longbows? And what exactly happened in the dark, secretive corridors of the French royal court that allowed a teenage visionary to seize control of a desperate nation, only to be burned alive by the very people she fought to protect? To understand how Europe plunged into a century of relentless slaughter, you have to forget everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. Forget the romanticized fairy tales of noble kings, honorable knights in shining armor, and chivalrous duels. The reality of 14th century Europe was essentially a massive, bloody mafia turf war, disguised by velvet robes and royal pageantry. At the center of it all was France. By the early 1300s, France was the undisputed superpower of the Western world. It was massively wealthy, culturally dominant, and possessed what was widely considered the medieval equivalent of nuclear weapons, the French heavy cavalry. The ruling Capetian dynasty had held a seemingly divine, unbroken grip on the throne for over 3 centuries. They were the untouchable, divinely appointed elites of the world. Until, suddenly, they weren't. In 1328, the French King Charles IV died unexpectedly without leaving a male heir. For the first time in 341 years, the French throne was completely empty. In the medieval world, a vacant throne wasn't just a political headache. It was a blood-soaked, ticking time bomb. Enter Edward III. He was the young, fiercely ambitious King of England. And more importantly, he was the closest living male relative to the dead French king through his mother, Isabella, infamously known across Europe as the she-wolf of France. By all traditional rights of blood, Edward had a rock-solid claim to unite the crowns of England and France. He was poised to create an unstoppable medieval mega-empire that would have dominated the globe. But the French nobility absolutely despised the idea of a foreign English king ruling over them. So, they panicked and dusted off an ancient, incredibly convenient legal loophole known as Salic law. This obscure Frankish code basically stated that royal inheritance could not pass through a woman. Using this bureaucratic technicality, the French lords essentially told Edward to get lost and handed the most powerful crown in Europe to a purely French cousin, Philip of Valois. Put yourself in Edward's shoes, you've just been robbed of half the civilized world by a manufactured legal loophole. You aren't just going to write a strongly worded letter. You are going to burn their world to the ground. Tensions boiled over when Philip, flexing his new royal muscles, brazenly confiscated the Duchy of Aquitaine, a massive, lucrative slice of southwestern France that belonged to the English crown. For Edward, this was the ultimate insult. In 1337, he officially declared himself the rightful king of France, plunging the two nations into what would become a 116-year nightmare. But here is what makes this conflict so uniquely terrifying, and why it matters to the very fabric of how modern wars are fought. Edward knew he couldn't beat the massive, heavily funded French armies in a traditional, honorable head-to-head fight. France had exponentially more money, more men, and the ultimate home field advantage. So, Edward took the sacred, unwritten rulebook of chivalry and threw it out the window. He didn't target the French armies. He targeted the French people. Edward unleashed a brutal campaign of psychological and economic terror known as the chevauchée. Imagine thousands of English soldiers riding furiously through the undefended French countryside, intentionally bypassing heavily guarded military fortresses. Instead, they systematically slaughtered livestock, burned crop fields to ash, pillaged churches, and massacred innocent commoners. It was state-sponsored terrorism. The strategy was brutally simple: destroy the French economy, starve the population, and prove to the peasants that their shiny, heavily armored new king was completely powerless to protect them. For the average person trapped in this meat grinder, life became an apocalyptic hellscape. You could spend your entire existence peacefully farming a tiny plot of dirt, only to wake up one morning to the deafening thunder of English hooves. Within minutes, your village is ablaze, your livelihood is destroyed, and your family is dead, all because two inbred royals hundreds of miles away couldn't agree on who got to wear a piece of gold on their head. To make matters unimaginably worse, right in the middle of this man-made carnage, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, swept across Europe, wiping out roughly a third of the population. Yet the war didn't stop. It just became more ruthless. Humiliated and raging for revenge, the French nobility finally took the bait. They raised a massive, seemingly invincible army, determined to corner and crush these English raiders once and for all. When the two forces finally met on the battlefield, the French outnumbered the English by a staggering margin. The aristocratic knights of France lowered their lances, ready to ride down the exhausted, starving English soldiers in a glorious, honorable cavalry charge. It was supposed to be a total massacre. And it was, but the men screaming, bleeding out and drowning in the mud that day weren't the English. August 26, 1346. The Battle of Crécy. The French heavy cavalry charged with the unstoppable momentum of a modern armored tank division. They fully expected to ride down the exhausted English raiders and end the war in a single afternoon. But the English had a secret weapon that would render centuries of knightly dominance completely obsolete in a matter of minutes: the Welsh longbow. This wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a medieval machine gun with a 150-pound draw weight. English commoners had been legally mandated to train with it since childhood, literally warping their own skeletal structures just to handle the immense tension. When the French charged, the sky went dark. The English unleashed a mechanized storm of up to 12 arrows a minute per man. Over 50,000 steel-tipped projectiles rained down every 60 seconds. Armor didn't matter. The bodkin arrows punched through chainmail, shattered collarbones, and most devastatingly, they hit the horses. Thousands of tons of screaming, bleeding horseflesh crashed headfirst into the dirt, crushing the elite French nobility underneath. It was a slaughter. The age of chivalry died screaming in the mud of Crécy. But if France thought this was rock bottom, they were dead wrong. Enter Edward, the Black Prince. The English king's heir, dressed in midnight black armor, brought an entirely new level of terror to the continent. He didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to break the psychological will of the French nation. 10 years after Crécy, the French got their chance at revenge at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The French king, John the Good, led an overwhelming force to crush the Black Prince. The result? Another total, unmitigated catastrophe. The English didn't just decimate the French army, they did the unthinkable. They captured the French king. Imagine the sitting president of the United States being taken hostage by a hostile foreign military. France immediately went into utter meltdown. The ransom demand was set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum that completely bankrupted the nation. Without a king to keep order, the country fractured. Starving, heavily taxed peasants finally snapped, sparking a massive, ultra-violent uprising known as the Jacquerie. Mobs of desperate commoners hunted down the surviving French nobility, burning their chateaux and slaughtering their families in the streets. France wasn't just losing a war against England anymore, it was eating itself alive. Yet, against all odds, the sheer geographical size of France kept it from total collapse. The war dragged into a grueling, multi-generational stalemate. Decades passed, kings died, plagues returned. The borders shifted back and forth in a relentless meat grinder. Until 1415, when a new English king crossed the Channel looking for blood. His name was Henry V. He didn't just want a slice of French territory, he wanted to claim the entire French throne once and for all. Henry landed his army in Normandy, but the campaign immediately turned into a disaster. Dysentery swept through his camp, killing thousands. His army was starving, diseased, and forced into a desperate retreat toward the English stronghold of Calais. But they never made it. A massive French army cut them off near a sleepy, rain-soaked village called Agincourt. This was the final stand. The French fielded a staggering force of up to 30,000 men, packed with dukes, counts, and the highest-born elites of Europe. Henry V had maybe 7,000 men left. They were exhausted, malnourished, and literally fighting without pants on because their dysentery was so severe. By every metric of military strategy, the English were about to be erased from existence, but the French made a fatal, arrogant mistake. Blind with bloodlust and desperate to avenge decades of humiliation, the French nobility ignored all tactical discipline. They funneled their massive army into a narrow, recently plowed field flanked by dense woods, a field that had been soaked by torrential autumn rain. It was a deadly bottleneck of thick, knee-deep clay. When the French knights advanced in full-plate armor, weighing up to 80 pounds, every step sucked them deeper into the earth. They were packed so tightly together that they couldn't even raise their weapons. Then, the English longbowmen opened fire. It was a conveyor belt of death. The French couldn't move forward, they couldn't retreat, and they began tripping over the bodies of their own comrades. The mud became a suffocating mass grave. Hundreds of French knights drowned standing up, pushed face first into the freezing muck by the sheer weight of the thousands of men pressing in from behind. When the English archers ran out of arrows, they didn't retreat. These barefoot sick peasants dropped their bows, drew their daggers, picked up lead mallets, and waded directly into the slaughterhouse. They bypassed the thick armor by driving spikes through the eye slits of the immobilized French aristocrats. The absolute flower of French nobility was exterminated in a single afternoon. Agincourt permanently broke the back of France. The nation descended into a savage internal civil war between two rival factions, the Armagnacs, and the Burgundians. Seizing the chaos, the Burgundians actively allied with the English, opening the gates of Paris itself. By 1420, the humiliated, mentally unstable French King Charles VI was forced into the Treaty of Troyes. This wasn't just a peace treaty. It was a national death warrant. Charles legally disinherited his own son and named King Henry V of England as the sole heir to the French throne. France was officially wiped off the map. It was now nothing more than a subjugated territory of a new English empire. The rightful French heir, the Dauphin, was a depressed, isolated fugitive hiding in the south. The English immediately laid siege to Orléans, the very last strategic stronghold keeping them from total, uncontested domination. The garrison was starving. The walls were crumbling. Hope was entirely dead. The 116-year war was effectively over, and England had won. But just as the final nail was being hammered into the coffin of French history, a bizarre, almost impossible rumor began to spread through the desperate, muddy camps of the remaining French resistance. A rumor of a teenage girl in men's armor, riding under a white banner, sent directly by God to do what no king, no knight, and no army had been able to do. It sounds like a myth. A 17-year-old illiterate peasant girl named Joan, hailing from the obscure village of Domremy, walked into the exiled court of the Dauphin, Charles VII, and demanded control of the French army. By all the rigid, unbending rules of medieval society, she should have been laughed out of the room, locked in an asylum, or executed on the spot. But you have to understand what was happening in the dark, secretive corridors of the French royal court. It was a viper's nest of bankrupt, defeated lords who were out of money, out of men, and completely out of options. The Dauphin was a deeply paranoid, depressed sovereign ruling over a fractured, dying kingdom. He didn't hand his armies over to Joan because he necessarily believed she was speaking directly to the Archangel Michael. He did it because he had literally nothing left to lose. For the cynical French nobility, Joan was the ultimate desperate PR stunt. She was a psychological weapon meant to rally a broken, starving peasantry. If she failed, the crown could simply wash their hands of a crazy peasant girl. But if she somehow succeeded, the king would reap all the glory. And succeed she did. In May 1429, Joan didn't just act as a spiritual mascot. She donned a suit of custom-made white armor, grabbed her personal banner, and rode directly into the meat grinder at the Siege of Orléans. She bypassed the cautious, failed strategies of the aristocratic generals and led ferocious, head-on assaults against the English fortifications. During one charge, she took an English arrow directly to the shoulder, was carried off the field, pulled the projectile out herself, and marched right back into the bloodbath. In just 9 days, Joan of Arc completely shattered the English siege. It was a tactical miracle that sent shockwaves across Europe. The myth of English invincibility was broken. The psychological momentum of the entire war flipped overnight. In a matter of months, she steamrolled through English territory, practically dragging the hesitant Charles VII to the cathedral at Reims to be officially consecrated as the absolute divine King of France. But this is where the dark, ruthless reality of medieval politics reared its ugly head. Once Charles got his crown, his priorities shifted entirely. He no longer needed a crusading holy warrior. He needed diplomats. Joan wanted to march on Paris and drive the English into the sea. Charles wanted to negotiate treaties and consolidate his newly acquired power. To the French royal court, the teenage visionary who had just saved their nation was suddenly a dangerous, uncontrollable liability. So, they let her fall. In 1430, Joan was captured during a skirmish by the Burgundians, who promptly offered to sell her to the English. All Charles VII had to do was pay her ransom. He had the money. He had the power. He owed her his entire kingdom. He didn't pay a single cent. He completely ghosted her. Charles VII, the man she had quite literally crowned, abandoned her to the enemy without a word of protest. He allowed the English to drag her to Rouen, subject her to a rigged, politically motivated trial for heresy and cross-dressing, and burn her alive at the stake in 1431. By letting her die, Charles absorbed her legendary status, united the French peasantry in a collective rage, and permanently silenced the only person who could challenge his authority. It was a master class in political betrayal. But burning Joan was the most fatal miscalculation the English ever made. They thought they were executing a rebel. Instead, they birthed an immortal martyr. Her horrific death did what no king had been able to do in 100 years. It forged a unified, unshakable French national identity. And while the English celebrated the demise of the Maid of Orléans, Charles VII used the breathing room she bought him to execute the most vital military reform in European history. He realized that the era of relying on arrogant, undisciplined feudal lords who charged blindly into mud was over. He completely reorganized the military, instituting the Compagnie d'Ordonnance. This was Europe's first permanent, state-funded, professional standing army since the fall of the Roman Empire. No more temporary levies, no more feudal contracts, just highly disciplined, regularly paid soldiers whose sole, unwavering loyalty was to the crown. But a standing army wasn't enough to counter the devastating mechanization of the English longbow. To finally turn the tide, the French turned to something that didn't just pierce armor, it pulverized it: gunpowder. Led by the brilliant Bureau brothers, the French military developed a devastatingly mobile artillery train. The days of men holding yew wood and string were about to meet the merciless reality of industrial warfare. In 1453, exactly 116 years after Edward III first claimed the French throne, the final showdown occurred at the Battle of Castillon. The English commander, John Talbot, still clinging to the outdated, romanticized ideals of chivalry, ordered a massive head-on infantry charge against an entrenched French position. But this time, there were no exhausted peasants waiting to be slaughtered in the mud. There were 300 heavy cannons loaded and aimed. When the French artillery opened fire, it was an apocalyptic storm of iron and smoke. The English ranks were shredded in seconds. Longbows were entirely useless against explosive shrapnel, and solid iron cannonballs tearing through human flesh at supersonic speeds. The slaughter of Crécy and Agincourt was avenged in a brutal, mechanized massacre. The English army was annihilated, and their commander was left dead on the field. With that final, deafening barrage, the English were driven off the continent, retaining nothing but the tiny port of Calais. The 116-year nightmare was over. What began as an arrogant, localized family dispute over a legal loophole had mutated into a century of unadulterated carnage that fundamentally rewired the globe. The English longbow had exposed the fatal vulnerability of the armored knight, burying the romanticized age of chivalry in the freezing, blood-soaked mud of Agincourt. But it was the cynical betrayal of a teenage visionary and the relentless, deafening blast of artillery that ultimately birthed the modern era of state-sponsored militaries. The velvet robes, the chivalric duels, and the untouchable medieval lords were gone forever. Out of the ashes of those 116 years, the modern nation-state was forged in blood, iron, and fire. That fire didn't stop burning at the Battle of Castillon. The brutal realization that technology, ruthless pragmatism and political manipulation could completely rewrite the global order became the absolute blueprint for the modern world. The death of chivalry was merely the opening act. From the choking smoke of early cannons to the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century, history has continuously proven one terrifying, undeniable truth. Those who adapt survive, and those who cling to romanticized traditions are left dead in the mud. We often look back at history through a sanitized lens, treating these monumental shifts as inevitable, boring dates in a textbook. But as you've just seen with the cynical betrayal of Joan of Arc and the apocalyptic roar of French artillery, the real story is always darker, highly calculating, and infinitely more fascinating. Understanding these violent turning points isn't just about memorizing the past. It's about decoding the hidden mechanics of power, warfare, and human ambition that still dictate how our world operates right now. If you don't understand the ruthless foundations of our empires, you are completely blind to the next seismic shift. That is exactly what we do here. We strip away the myths, the comfortable legends, and the historical propaganda to expose the raw, unfiltered engines of human civilization. We dissect the brilliant strategies, the fatal miscalculations, and the masterclasses in political betrayal that built the reality you wake up to every single day. If you want to go beyond the surface and uncover the brutal truths of how our world was actually forged, hit the subscribe button right now. Join us as we continue to tear down the sanitized versions of the past and analyze the supreme mechanics of survival and conquest. The real story has just begun.